Hi, welcome to the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction's Friday Forum for Friday, May 12th, 2023. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer, Dr. Keith Porter. This is one in a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research or other useful knowledge related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. Last time, we brought you ICLR's Director of Partnerships, Sophie Guilbeault. She presented case studies from ICLR's Cities Adapt program, showing us examples of how municipalities can take resilience into their own hands and help fix their own problems rather than waiting for codes or bigger government to solve their problems. The slides and video are available at ICLR's website, www.iclr.org/workshops. Next time, on Friday, June 9th, Julius Gombos will speak on nature-based flood protection on Toronto's waterfront. And we will have an unusual second June Friday Forum as well. On June 23rd, Aisha Hortaxu will tell us what she learned from a field visit to the epicentral region of the February earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. But today we are very privileged to have speaking to us my esteemed colleagues, Janiele Maffei and Dr. Sharyl Rabinovici of the California Earthquake Authority, which is the state's earthquake insurer for homes. They'll tell us why and how people should seismically retrofit older wood frame houses with affordable standardized methods. Let me introduce our speakers a little bit more thoroughly. They are two of America's leading thinkers on how and why to get people to do seismic retrofit on their homes. Janiele on the nuts and bolts, dollars and cents side, Sharyl on the communication, influence, and social psychology side. They know probably more than anybody else about how an insurer explains, motivates, and finances seismic retrofit. By the way, Janiele's structural engineer license is a step above the professional engineering license. SEs are California's elite earthquake engineers, and Dr. Rabinovici is one of, I don't know, count them on one hand, public policy communication experts when it comes to explaining seismic resilience to the public. Before our speakers begin, here's our agenda. Our webinar lasts 90 minutes. Our speakers will present for about half that time. Then I will moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box. I'll try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question and then move on to others, then circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded. ICLR will post our speakers' slides and a link to the video on Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who couldn't attend, let them know. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Janiele and Sharyl.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that very warm introduction, Keith. I really appreciate it. And you should be seeing my slides. Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to share what we're doing in California, particularly at the California Earthquake Authority around mitigation. And there it is. Wanted to start with, I was trying to familiarize myself a little bit with Canada's seismic risk. I'm certainly familiar with the risk on the West Coast, as I'm sure all of you are. And as you know, British Columbia has the most earthquake risk in Canada, but of course I was very interested to find over in the eastern part, of course, Ottawa. I was really surprised to see the warm colors, of course, being higher probability, higher risk, and then of course the Western Quebec seismic zone. So obviously areas of high population have in fact seismic risk, and so I was feeling quite at home looking at this, and of course really surprised by some of the larger earthquake magnitudes over on the eastern coast of Canada. So with that in mind, I prepared a presentation. I always want to start with a little bit about who we are at the California Earthquake Authority, because we're very unique, and then to explain how we have mitigation as part of our charge. So California Earthquake Authority is not an agency of the state of California, but rather a not-for-profit residential earthquake insurance provider, created in 1996 to ensure availability affordability of earthquake insurance to homeowners in California, restore the real estate market, and enable participating insurers, which are the group that actually sell the CEA policy, to satisfy what we call the mandatory offer. And so in order to understand why we were created, you have to go back to 1984, when, as the picture shows you, the MAC came out. So that's an important thing to note, because seismic or earthquake risk modeling was really at its infancy in '84. This is about the scale of the computing that was going on. But the state legislature was keenly aware of the earthquake risk and wanted earthquake insurance to be available. However, made it so that an earthquake insurance policy is separate from a homeowner's policy. So you have to get a separate policy. But they also said that in order to write a homeowner's policy in California, you must offer earthquake insurance. So the mandatory offer comes to the insurance company. The homeowner is not obligated to purchase, but it must be offered to them. Along came the 1994 Northridge earthquake. With that modeling in its infancy, the insurance companies lost their shirts. $40 billion in damage, half of that residential, half of that insured. And with that mandatory offer in place, this was not a market that was suitable for the earthquake insurance providers. And so we're going to stop writing insurance in the state of California, of course, an insurance and a lending crisis. So the state legislature stepped in and created this unique instrumentality of the state, publicly managed. We report to a governing board that includes the top 3 elected officials, privately financed by the participating insurers bringing some capital to us when they join, and then, of course, the policyholders contributing premium annually. Our mission from day one: to educate, mitigate, and insure. Educate to make sure that people could make informed decisions about their risk and what to do about it. Mitigate to reduce damage, as well as to transfer it by our core business, insurance. I mentioned participating insurers. You'll see all major companies here. We do not sell the policy. These participating insurers will sell the policy and offer it, obviously, to all of their insured, sell it, and in the event of an earthquake would actually be the claim adjuster, and then, of course, the check would come from the California Earthquake Authority. So the CEA today, just as a reminder, California has 2/3 of the United States earthquake risk. Huge risk. We insure more than 1.1 million residences, or about 10% of the homes in California. In certain areas, we have pretty good coverage. We have as many as 30%. Obviously, we've got the Central Valley with, very, very cost-effective to get earthquake insurance, but not a lot of risk. CEA accounts for 66% of that residential earthquake market in California. So in addition to our residential earthquake insurance, we have the California Residential Mitigation Program, which provides the grants. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then, just as a note, in case you hear our name associated with wildfire, we don't have wildfire insurance, but rather we financially manage the fund set up by the state of California to cover investor-owned utilities. We had a bankruptcy with one of our major utilities. So just in case you heard that is in fact what that fund does. But once again, mitigation part of the charge from day one, but they started putting money into a fund, but they didn't have any leadership until 2010, when the CEA, who had joined in 2008, realized that this loss mitigation fund needed leadership. And so let me tell you about that loss mitigation fund that needed leadership. So essentially from day one, they said, what we want you to do is to, on an annual basis, take the capital that the CEA has, which is just under $6 billion now, and that's invested, obviously, conservatively, so that just under $6 billion, 5% up to $5 million will go into the loss mitigation fund annually for mitigation. So in 2010, there was about $25 million in this fund, but once again, no leadership. And so we had to go back to the legislation to create essentially my job. The Chief Mitigation Officer was created to manage, to create mitigation incentive programs and other programs deemed appropriate by the board. So I joined in 2011 and hit the ground running with that 25 million that was in the bank and that annual $5 million. But recognized that we need to do a little bit more than just create an incentive program, but to develop additional standards, to do some research, and then once again to do the core mission of mitigation at the CEA, which is to provide incentives. So the standards, what we did is we went in with FEMA. FEMA is responsible for a number of our model codes in the United States, particularly those around existing buildings. And we went in as co-sponsor and funder of FEMA P1100, that is vulnerability-based assessment of the seismic retrofit of 1 and 2 family dwellings. And then we also, recognizing some significant challenges in adjusting claims after the Northridge earthquake, finalized this earthquake damage assessment document that is replaced this other document, Curie documents, essentially to standardize damage assessment and repair after an earthquake. So those 2 documents, this FEMA P1100 is the core now of our mitigation program. Very important to have standards. You can't just tell people we're going to give you some money to do whatever you want, which is what has been going on in the past. And then very, very importantly, by continuing that standard development, we closed the loop on the post-earthquake damage assessment. So what's the whole goal here with our mitigation program is not just to reduce damage in terms of dollar amount, in terms of the exposure to both the individual and perhaps an insurance company, but also to make an impact on habitability. Housing is so very important and impacted across the world, and very much so in California. So the idea here was to look at essentially, what impedes habitability after an earthquake. Well, in California, red and yellow tags, there's a safety posting, a house that appears to be unsafe, they need to, for both, in the event of an aftershock, then of course just under gravity loads. And then the idea is the potential for a gas leak or fire. So with that framework in mind, it's important to note that we weren't just looking at dollar amounts. But FEMA P1100 categorized the top 4 vulnerabilities in single family wood framed structures. And these are very common in California. We have a moderate climate and a great deal of opportunity to use timber, and the majority of our residential construction is timber, which is good news in that it's light and typically redundant. However, there are known vulnerabilities, and here's the top 4. This kind of crawl space, cripple wall, that floor used to be at the height of that stair, living space over garage when you take out all the elements that resist earthquake forces on that ground floor to introduce a garage, the kind of pole house, the hillside house, and the ubiquitous unreinforced masonry chimney. So with those top 4, we went after the most common and the one that is the easiest for a homeowner to identify. And with that in mind, this crawl space house, that one on the left, that crawl space house that lacks anchorage and bracing of the walls around it, we started by saying, all right, how much are we saving the homeowner? How much are we saving essentially our portfolio as an insurance company if we do that retrofit? So we went to an organization to look at that. And I wanted to just make a correlation here that we have so many, as I mentioned, that very, very common in that pre-1950 house. And you can often find it in the pre-1980 house, that bungalow that built around the 2 world wars. Here's a picture of those very common crawl space houses in Berkeley, California. And then, of course, I immediately recognized this vulnerability my first time that I went to Vancouver. These are found wherever you have wood framed houses. It's very important to note. And this is what happens to them. They come off their foundation. You can see they are a fire damage risk. And this is a life safety risk. You see this porch that's blocked the means of egress to this house that had frankly had a severed gas main and was fortunate it didn't catch on fire. Can even happen to the smaller houses. This house is really rather modest and only about 12 inches high in that crawl space, but significant damage, costly and disruptive. And of course, I noted even on the East Coast, of course, there is in the single family dwellings considerable wood construction. So what was that research for? It was so that we could have at our fingertips quantification of the reduction in damage. And so Dr. Sharyl Rabinovici worked on this project and assisted in putting together some graphics and some language for us, essentially so we can sell the retrofit. And here's what we found is the worst performer is the 2-story wood-sided house, the best performer, the 1-story stucco house. We looked at 4 scenario earthquakes for this graphic. Let me choose the San Francisco magnitude 7. So this is a scenario, meaning a potential earthquake. For that worst performing house, the 2-story wood-sided, we found that the reduction in damage is $200,000. Now I feel like a commercial here, but wait, that was for a $200 per square foot replacement cost, which is off by a factor of 2 to 3 in San Francisco. We're talking about more than $500,000 in reduction in damage for retrofitting this worst performer. And you can see we're up in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for even the best performer. And of course, we did that for geographic locations around the state. So armed with this information about seeing in past earthquakes, these poor performers, knowing how much money we can save, we went after retrofit incentive programs. And very important to note, and we tell everyone, anyone who will listen, and of course, all of our documents, retrofitting is not earthquake proofing. Retrofitting is not earthquake proofing. We are intending to go after a particular vulnerability to make damage less likely and to increase the likelihood the house will remain habitable. So we did that with a mitigation incentive program called the California Residential Mitigation Program, jointly managed by the CEA and the state's FEMA, which is the California Office of Emergency Services. So jointly managed by this separate entity. And it is a separate board with 2 members from each of those organizations. The intent here to get some of the agency status from Cal OES. Once again, we are not an agency, but also to include this very important agency in our decision making. And our first incentive program rolled out in 2013, Earthquake, Brace, and Bolt. Earthquake, Brace, and Bolt. 2013-14 was our pilot program, and we have now retrofitted. I got to change this graphic tomorrow because we are on the cusp of hitting 20,000 houses retrofitted in California with our grants. We provide up to a $3,000 grant for owner-occupied houses in certain zip codes, very high seismic zip codes, who do a code-compliant retrofit. They don't bring the whole building up to code standards, but they do a complete retrofit of that crawl space with that standard that we funded. And here's the cost effectiveness. Just, more than a third of our retrofits cost less than $7,000. And there's a significant difference between the San Francisco Bay Area. Costs are significantly higher there. And so down in Southern California, the majority of our retrofits are going to be in that $4,000 to $5,000 zone with a $3,000 grant. You can see we're really assisting in making these cost effective. The work takes about 2 to 3 days. This is what we're doing. We're going under the house. We're bolting, bracing with plywood, clipping at the top, creating a nice connection from that floor down to that foundation. In a little shorter house, we come in from the side with our anchors. And of course, we may have a house that just needs to be bolted. These are close to that $3,000 mark, particularly in Southern California. Cost effective, 2 to 3 days. Hardest thing they'll do is getting a contractor to call them back. But once they do, we find this program to be very successful. We identified our zip codes in California. Those are our postal zip codes based on seismicity, weighted 50%. And the number of pre-1940 houses weighted 50%. So we weighted that 50% hazard, 50% vulnerability to identify where to go first, because we knew that we didn't have sufficient funding each year to roll it out to the entire state of California. We would have tens of thousands of people on waiting lists, no better way to discourage them. So we started with 4 zip codes and we're now in 571 zip codes, and we have always been able to exhaust our waiting list. So this has been a good way to grow here. Very excited as well that for the folks that can't do that extra piece of the retrofit cost, we have a supplementary grant for income qualifying homeowners so that they can get additional funding to be able to, in most cases, get the entire retrofit. So very excited to be able to introduce this supplementary grant for homeowners whose household income is $72,000 or less. A study done at UCLA said that by our impact is in fact creating some equity in Southern California. They see numbers after 2013 when we started retrofitting that have increased the retrofit increased the retrofit rate in zip codes that have high representations of Black, Hispanic, and low-income citizens. So we're very excited to see this. And this was before we rolled out those supplementary grants. This is just with the $3,000. So we hope to do another study to show that the supplementary grant is making even better inroads. Just introduced earthquake soft story, that second vulnerability where I mentioned you go in, you take out all the walls. These are the beautiful houses everybody thinks of when they think of San Francisco. They survived the 1906 earthquake, 7.8. They survived that and the fire, surprisingly. Without retrofit, probably would not be able to do the same performance, because you see every single one of them, they came in the 1920s and took out all the walls on the ground floor and put a giant garage door in. Excuse me, to install a garage. So basically, the introduction of the automobile to California wasn't so good on California architecture and resiliency. You can see in the 1989 damage, every earthquake really, we can find these houses. We don't know how many of them they are, but we do know how to retrofit them. These are the elements you would put into a new house to avoid this garage issue. Essentially, you're going to strengthen those piers either side of the door and put a plywood or a different sheathing around the rest of the garage. More expensive retrofit, we're more now into the $15,000, $20,000 retrofit, and our grants are going to be up to $13,000. So we just rolled that out. We will see how successful it is, and hopefully we'll be able to attract additional funding. In terms of funding, the final mitigation program that we're going after, we haven't started this because we don't have funding yet, is the potential multifamily soft story retrofit. We've gone after some grants from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and we have potential to get some money from the state of California. It was appropriated, but it has not been budgeted. We're hoping that will happen someday so that we can go after these larger structures. We saw significant damage and deadly damage in the 1994 Northridge earthquake, and we're making inroads in California with some mandatory ordinances to retrofit these buildings. We'd like to bring some funding to that. And this is how you retrofit those, with these nice steel frames and new foundations. So just quickly to end, our mitigation funding for 9 years, we've been able to leverage that CEA loss mitigation fund with both state and federal mitigation funding. We had 2 years where the state gave us $3 million each year, and we are now able to leverage with this FEMA funding. So once again, Federal Emergency Management Agency. We currently are in the process of distributing $84 million in FEMA funding. So with that, very, very quick, very not as detailed as you might like, or maybe I gave you too much, but 3 websites: earthquakebracebolt.com, earthquakesoftstory.com, and then we have a separate strengthenmyhouse.com, which is how to mitigate, what you should do, but without any of the overlay of a funding resource. And with that, I know that Sharyl will help put this into context of why our program is so very important to the state of California. So with that, Sharyl, I'd like to turn it over to you. And I probably
All right, thank you, Janiele.
here.
That's fantastic. You set me up so well. And Janiele and I have known each other a long time. I just wanted to clarify from something he said that I'm not a CEA employee, but I have worked on a couple of projects for CEA over the years. So one of them is the 2014 Napa, California earthquake. We did a study together that was a big general population survey of what really happened to homeowners in that quake. Not just what happened to their houses in terms of the kind of damage and costs that came about from that, but how did it change how they feel about retrofitting? How did it affect how they feel about living in the area, buying insurance? That was a really interesting study that folks can ask us about later if you like. And then the second study, as Janiele mentioned, was about how to I participated in how to communicate about the results on the retrofit effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And we'll circle back to that towards the end of my talk. So I'm going to move across a lot of different terrain. Janiele set us up to understand the risk and the fixability of the risk. And I'm going to get more into the human and policy side of it. Let me get my share underway here. So First we do that. And then we do that. I need to see my dirty laundry first off. Okay. So jumping in, I see the world from a behavioral point of view. So if the brace and bolt retrofit is so beneficial to people, why don't they do it? Okay. So we think of people as rational. If something's in my best interest, maybe we should do it. But really, it seems so simple. Even cost is fairly low. The project only takes a few days. Life is full of these kinds of paradoxes, though, don't you know? Since when did everybody do everything they should do? There's one behavioral theorist I really like who calls it the messy desk syndrome. There's just so many things that are good to do. We can only do so many of them. So our choices are actually a lot less affected by rationality than we would like to believe. Here's the brick wall of behavior change, or one way to show it. What keeps us from taking actions that are in our best interests? Some of these might be familiar to you. I don't think that an earthquake is really going to affect me. It's going to affect me whether or not I do anything. I don't want to try to do a retrofit and have it be futile, or I don't think I'm capable of managing that kind of a project. I think the person who's recommending this to me just wants to make money. I'm not sure what kind of project. Maybe I should do it at the same time as I do other kind of home repairs in order to kind of bundle the work. And I've got a lot of other things on my mind. So the list of things that keep us from taking action are numerous, and it can just seem like we become blinded in this sea of challenges. And for any one person, it might be a subset of these. But what happens, I want to call attention a little bit to this word down here at the bottom, social proof, is that if enough of us are experiencing these kinds of barriers and not many of us are taking a particular action, we take as evidence that an action is not doable or not necessary to do or not worth doing. We take as evidence of that the fact that other people aren't doing it. So if I don't see a lot of people taking action on this, I don't have a chance to analyze the decision on my own. I'm just going to say, I don't know anybody who does this. I'm just going to do what everybody else does. And that's officially in the literature called social proof. And I believe, a lot of other researchers believe, that in behaviors that are really uncommon, you know, a quake might happen only once in 20 or 30 years. That's significant in your exact location. We substitute other people's judgment for our own because we don't have any personal experience with it, or our personal experience might be very misleading. For instance, a big quake that happens in Loma Prieta, which is actually 100 miles from my house, I might think, hey, my house did really great in that quake, but that's not really the type of quake that would truly impact me. So it's not a fair comparison or basis for making a risk assessment on my own property. And by the way, I am currently in a soft story wood frame home and saving up for that retrofit. I'm so excited, Janiele, that there's a prospect of a program that could help me out on that. It's a very big concern for me personally, as well as for my community. So when I first got into this field, I know this is like one of the spaghetti diagrams, but I was trying to grapple with the issue of what factors shape beliefs and behavior about risks, and in particular, low probability, high consequence risks like earthquakes. And on the left side of the screen here, we have some of the classic kind of, if you were thinking rational about what to do about quakes kind of things, you know, how big is the problem? What kind of consequences might happen to me? what's at stake for me? So that's, what do I understand about the threat? The action here in the lower left is, what do I understand about the remedy that is being recommended to me by experts? So how complex is it to do? Something that's interesting to me about retrofitting is it's really a multi-step kind of risk reduction, loss avoidance strategy. It's spread out over a number of months. It involves a lot of different things needing to come together. It involves getting help from other people. It's not actually, even though the retrofit seems simple in that, it's plywood and some bolts and a dude or a dudette for a couple of days doing the work, it is actually requires a lot of things kind of coming together. So those are well and great, but like I said, when you don't have a lot of experience, this is something somebody might do once or twice in their lifetime. A quake, we don't have a lot of experience personally with the quakes. We don't know a lot of people who have been in very serious earthquakes. Judgments tend to be, and behavior tend to be dominated by things on this right-hand side. So the social setting and individual factors, including emotion. So we can also substitute how we feel when we think about a risk for how likely the risk actually is and its potential severity to us. So let me say that again. If I think about an earthquake and I don't feel very panicked, that might encourage me to downgrade my assessment of how likely it is that I'm going to be impacted or how bad I might be impacted. And that's just a trick of how our brains work. It's not because we're not intelligent, caring, thoughtful human beings. It's just what we're wired to do. And again, in the upper right quadrant, that social proof, there's no laws requiring me to do this work. If government would make me do it, if it were really, really important, right? So I'm substituting there the government's assessment of the risk as a signal of whether I should take care of the risks, right? And I don't know very many people who are doing this. That's the social norms. That's the peer behavior. And I'm going to substitute that. There's also not a lot of shame or sense of stigma for not taking action because you don't know very many people who do it. No one's going to look at you as kind of the irresponsible odd person out in the dinner party who hasn't taken this step. And we have nobody we can rely on who's done it before, who can kind of streamline the process by telling us the right person, how it's going to feel, how happy they are afterwards. This is like kind of a perfect storm for inaction. Yeah. I would like to start out our discussion of the consequences of inaction on this issue. Janiele outlined a lot of it, but I really want to, I think this is a wonderful communication tool that's been used in California to communicate what happens in these big events, not just to individuals, but really at the societal scale. And Keith, Dr. Porter was deeply involved in this project run by the US Geological Survey, where I used to work for 5 years in the early 2000s, to try to unite the best science about how quakes happen, how likely they are, and where the shaking is going to go and what it's going to do to the built environment, and extend that into what it's going to do to the social threads of our community, the economic functioning of the community, of course, injuries and losses. But let's dive into this way of talking about earthquake risk, and hopefully this video will play well for everybody.
We are not hearing the audio, Cheryl. When you share a video, there's some sort of switch. And I don't remember. Mike, do you remember what you do to have the audio play across when you're showing from YouTube?
Yeah, when you go to select to share your screens, you have to stop sharing and start again. There's an option to play PC audio or play computer audio.
Share sound.
Yeah.
It says mono or stereo.
Mono's fine. Yeah.
Mono's fine. Share sound. And share my PowerPoint slides. Thank you for your patience, everybody.
The Hayward Fault, one of the most urbanized and dangerous faults in the United States. Millions of people live, work, and travel near the fault each day. There's a large earthquake on the Hayward Fault about every 100 to 220 years. The last one was 150 years ago. It's coming, and when the Hayward Fault ruptures, the roads, the pipes, the wires, the things that connect everyone to people and places will go haywire. The USGS and its partners have created a comprehensive, detailed analysis based on the latest science, a scenario depicting what might happen in a magnitude 7.0 earthquake on the Hayward Fault, before it happens. This gives us a chance to envision our vulnerabilities and a chance to prepare. This new scenario is set on April 18th, 2018, the anniversary of the 1906 Great San Francisco Earthquake and Fire. The following scenario explores the possibility of a Hayward Fault earthquake. It is not a prediction, and a real earthquake on the Hayward Fault could occur at any time and may behave quite differently. April 18th, 2018, 4:18 p.m. The earthquake begins. With an epicenter at Oakland, the rupture races 52 miles along the fault towards Fremont and Richmond at speeds of 7,000 miles per hour. In Berkeley and Hayward, the ground shifts 3 to 5 feet, ripping through buried pipes and wires. The USGS shake map shows areas of violent and extreme shaking, lasting up to 30 seconds or longer, causing very heavy damage. Away from the epicenter, a warning arrives up to 25 seconds before strong shaking begins. Impacts and destruction are magnified by a cascade of hazards. In the haywired scenario, 800 people die and 18,000 more are injured. 2,500 people need to be rescued from collapsed buildings, while another 22,000 are trapped in elevators. In this scenario, 77,000 to 152,000 households could be displaced. Some East Bay residents lose water for 6 weeks and up to 6 months in the worst hit areas. Lack of firefighting water could turn some of the more than 400 fires into conflagrations, burning the equivalent of 52,000 single-family homes. Who has power, water, gas, and communications? Every lifeline is disrupted to some extent. This could be the first major U.S. earthquake in the age of the internet. What happens in a disconnected world? Dozens of significant aftershocks and fault afterslip will cause additional costly damage, requiring repeated inspections and repairs. Property damage and direct business losses exceed $82 billion, mostly due to shaking, but also to liquefaction and landslides. Fires could cause hundreds more fatalities and an additional $30 billion damage, and would extend the duration of disruption. Few things are insured. How many people will move away? What will such a disaster mean to you, your family, and your community? Acting now can save lives and jobs, businesses, neighborhoods, and homes. The Bay Area has invested over $50 billion since the 1989 Loma Prieta quake. strengthening potential points of failure, infrastructure, and buildings. But these efforts need to continue and expand through your engagement. Use the Haywired scenario. Doing so will reveal actions that will lessen business disruption and improve our ability to bounce back. More actions like these will reduce risk, and creation of the Haywired scenario offers you an opportunity to do your part. Partners are continuing to come together to share interdependencies, resources, and solutions. Use the science. Come together, because together we can outsmart disaster.
Okay. I hope everybody saw that successfully. And let me get back on track with the rest of the slides here. There we go. All right. You know what? I feel like these next couple of slides, I want to move really quickly because we sort of already covered a lot of them. But what that video doesn't do is sort of show ripple effects that go out in time from the quake impacted area. And I just want to mention a couple of other effects. So thousands in local shelters for a months. I think a lot about the Houston Astrodome after New Orleans Hurricane Katrina. Businesses being shuttered, so temporary closures due to needing to repair, replace lost inventory, and so on. That's business operations loss. Some will go out of business. I'm thinking about the pandemic. You have a big societal impact to everybody all at once. Suddenly, business models and what works stops happening. Maybe those repairs are unaffordable. That means jobs are going to be lost. People move away. Rental prices are going to go up incredibly. Good contractors are not going to be available. Labor and material costs doubling is like an optimistic, I think, price estimate for that. And that's certainly going to hit the insurance industry straight on and make the insurance that you've already purchased less valuable to you. And rebuilding and recovery, we know from major quakes around the world, even in very developed countries like Japan, New Zealand, it's going to be a decade before people feel like the region has recovered. All right, that's a lot. I want to show you some puppies and kittens and babies right now, because literally, let's just take a deep breath. Because we know that risk and risk perception is fueled by how our bodies feel first and foremost. And when we are in a frame of mind where our pulse is racing, we're feeling overwhelmed by the information, and it's all negative information, that actually makes people freeze up and feel less capable. You know, if you have flight, fight, or freeze as the first three biologic reactions to impending threat, earthquakes tend to make people freeze. And the antidote to that is positive motion, actually. So we are going to talk about in various ways through the rest of my presentation on how to balance the need to talk about the real threat and the fact that talking about it only negatively impedes us from doing what we need to do about it. So we have to have an adequate, even more than compensating for emphasis on the positive aspects of getting involved, of facing it. You don't want to engage with something that feels crappy to engage with. You want to engage with something that is going to have an outcome that feels good. And again, that's the dominance of the emotional side of our belief in behavior system, as opposed to the rational, cognitive, calculator side. And we can use the positive emotions to bring us back into a mind state where we can think more deliberately and weigh costs and benefits with more confidence and our cognition. All right, shifting gears a little bit from psychology, I want to talk about public policy options. So if we are confronted as individuals with a lot of barriers to taking action and retrofit benefits both individuals and the broader community, how can we best support making sure these projects get done? And when I say we, I mean jurisdictions, nonprofits, and private sector stakeholders from various angles. I mean kind of collective interventions. And that's sort of the language of public policy. It's not all about the government doing. As Janiele showed with some of these programs, there's an elaborate enmeshing of state agencies and federal agencies and private entities. CEA is and its Brace and Bolt program is a wonderful example of how rarely does intervention in these kinds of spaces happen, in a straight line from the legislature passing a program and then implementing a state policy program themselves. It just doesn't happen that way. So let's start out with kind of the baseline public policy about this. And when I teach public policy, I like to remind students that if you don't have a policy, you have a policy. So the status quo is whatever you're doing now, and that is a policy. And in a lot of places, most places, we are leaving it to the individual to decide if they would like to do a retrofit on their home. Okay, there's nobody making them do it. It's voluntary. Why does that kind of policy tend to be in place? Well, it's the easiest. It's what we're doing now. It's the lowest cost policy from that intervention perspective. And particularly in America, we're very, obsessed with private choice and not imposing on the individual unless there's really a compelling case. However, we talked about it. It's not easy for us to understand this risk. We often have mistaken beliefs. The least vulnerable are the least protected, least likely to be able to voluntarily protect themselves. And we really aren't thinking about the long term and the bigger picture. Inform, Janiele has it in her, her recipe. It's great to go out and inform people. We can't make those rational decisions unless we get information. So we can preserve some choice, but provide people the information to make better decisions to themselves. It's a relatively affordable strategy. Unfortunately, it's really hard to get people's attention on this issue. And it sends a confusing signal. If it was really so beneficial, why isn't the government and my insurance company taking action on it? And it's actually still the least likely to help the most vulnerable, who are time poor, money poor, and are least likely to be reached by this kind of information. Okay, we can also require people ratcheting things up. We can require action. That gives us more assurance that the action will be done. It gives a level playing field. The requirements are clear, and we're proactively protecting people where they might not be able to make that choice for themselves. It just reduces uncertainty a lot. But we have to have political will to make people do it. There's a lot of concern about people being displaced once the costs of housing go up. Once you make people build things, money gets spent, and somehow that has to be accommodated. It takes money to run the programs. It distracts. You have to enforce that people do what you said. There's a lot of complications here too. So the example that Janiele gave of soft story wood frame apartment buildings shows how policy approaches vary in strictness. There's a spectrum, and some cities choose to kind of phase it in over time, or politically they can take the step of requiring a screening for vulnerabilities. And then later, once they know enough vulnerable buildings are in their community, the city feels confident proceeding with a mandatory retrofit policy. This is the level of action that we have on soft story multifamily buildings in California. It's really very significant. And at this stage of social engagement on this issue, an apartment landlord can no longer claim ignorance or social proof that this is not a problem and that it's not fixable, because a lot of cities are tackling it. So you can't claim ignorance anymore. Your building, your liability has gone up because everybody knows this is a vulnerable building type. Incentives are the less costly and less coercive, yet still effective remedy. And they're really, Janiele, I gotta say, one of my favorites. It sends a strong signal, gets the attention, shares the cost burden, which really psychologically matters to people. They know that what they're doing benefits not just themselves. So why doesn't the government or their insurer help share the burden of producing that shared benefit? And you can do a lot of the quality control and targeting, as Janiele's program demonstrates. It is still piecemeal. You still have to run a difficult program, so it's got that ramp up. You still have to invest in a lot of marketing to capture people's interest, and there's still that risk of not reaching the most vulnerable. We need to run programs well in order to do that. So I don't want to go too deep into this, but Keith asked me to talk a little bit about effective risk communication, and it involves a lot of work from different angles. The key points here are really involvement and two-way communication, which requires technical people to get out of the mindset of talking based on their own goals, and we have to shift the content design to talk with people in relation to their goals and how we can help them. We need different messages for different audiences. We need different formats and methods of getting our word out for different audiences. So those are just like the fastest possible overview on some good practices in that. First, you start by identifying and trying to engage with the people who are affected by this issue. And this is just like kind of a word cloud of sorts of the types of players in this space. And just by looking at these, you can see they all have really different stakes, really different levels of resources, different distractions going on. Each one has something to contribute. They're a piece of the puzzle, but nobody can work on their own to address the issue. So that's why we have to get groups together and start talking. When we're talking, again, we need that receiver-focused communication, going to how it affects them, what they can do about it, ways to get more information, ways to overcome obstacles, rather than us just projecting what we think they should be doing. In the space of retrofit specifically, this was how we analyzed the stakeholders involved in CEA's desire to communicate the benefits of the brace and bolt retrofit. And we lumped audiences into three groups. The group that doesn't read studies, the group that cares about the details of how to do stuff and is really thinking about it on a house by house basis, and the group that's thinking about it from a public policy intervention strategy community level. Each of these audiences needs different reports, different communicators. They have different trusted sources of information, and they literally need different information because they care about the issue for different reasons. So think about that receiver of the information. What is it they're currently doing? what do you want them to know, and focus on how what you want them to do relates to how that relates to their goals and the leap between what they're currently doing and what their goals are. I always like to mention the value of plain speak. So we use a lot of jargon when we're creating advice for technical audiences or system influencers, but really there's no benefit of using that kind of jargon. It's very off-putting and barrier creating. So we have to move back to just the simplest possible way to say things and keep ourselves true to that whenever we go out there, so that it's second nature. I mentioned earlier the brick wall psychologically that keeps us from taking action. I want to show that the bricks, we also have bricks that can pave the path to the kind of behavior change that we know is advantageous. I mentioned the benefits of positivity. So framing our pitch in more of a emotionally positive light. We have to convey risk information, which is bad news. And that is great for getting attention, but it's terrible for getting behavior change. So we immediately have to shift to the good news part of the equation. We also need to repeat this action enough that it becomes easier for us and easier for us to tell other people how to do it. And we hate doing things by ourselves. So anything we can do to unite people in doing this together, that's one benefit of Janiele's program acting in specific communities. You start getting the conversation between real estate agents. Hey, I had a client who did that. This program's really great. Let me tell you how. Here's a variety of other evidence-based, documented ways that help people overcome doing hard things. And we can tap into any of these in our messaging. I know marketers know how to do it, but sometimes we forget when we're running public programs that we are also marketers. We're just marketers in the public interest. I'll wrap up there so that we have time for questions. Apologies if that was more in-depth or not as in-depth as you wanted on any particular thing, but I'm excited to hear what these ideas spark for you, what kind of challenges in your work relate to them. And thanks again for the opportunity to share some of this way of thinking about this issue.
Thank you so much. This has been a great talk. We don't have any Q&A from the attendees yet, but let me plant a seed in their minds. I find that conversation can be more fruitful the more distant the points of view that are presented are. So I urge our
devil's advocate time.
Devil's advocate, absolutely. I urge our attendees to think of your most skeptical, your strongest argument against imitating the CEA's program, and let's pose those arguments to our speakers and see if we can learn something. Oh, okay. Here's our first one. And by the way, I have a lot of questions, so don't worry that we're not gonna have things to talk about. So Eric Guthrie says, great presentations on the benefits of retrofit for the homes with crawl spaces. From what I understand, the research and models indicated that a $200 per square foot home would suffer perhaps $200,000 less damage by doing the retrofit. Have there been any actual earthquake losses on any retrofitted homes to validate if the model has been proven accurate?
Yeah, so that's a problem because our last really damaging earthquake was in 1994. And as a person who's old enough to have done a lot of post-earthquake damage assessment, we were doing it in pen and paper and manila folders, and the majority of the the work was being done by a claim adjuster and nobody was noting whether or not a house was retrofitted or not. So then that's the long answer for not from the Northridge earthquake. The two pictures that I showed on my very first slide are of the Napa earthquake and the recent Ferndale earthquakes up north. Show side-by-side retrofitted houses with unretrofitted houses, where red tagged house 2.5 years later, not reoccupied, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we knew that the houses, I talked to both the owners, had tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage. And so we've certainly seen it, but I have to say it's anecdotal. And we've done within the CEA, as I said, we have a small piece of the market, right? But within ours, we now require that when a claim adjuster goes out, that they're supposed to note if the house has been retrofitted or not. So we're trying to implement process going forward so that we'll have that data. But it is maddening, and it's very difficult to even go back and look at building code records, because if somebody took out a permit, typically what they said was they did some kind of voluntary retrofit, or and they never say that there was a standard that it was done to. So unfortunately, not a lot of data. I will tell you though that with the peer research, we already have in place a 20% reduction in premium for the retrofitted house, and we're looking to see with that peer research if we can't increase that over time. I think all of you who are in the insurance professionals understand to decrease someone's premium because they've retrofitted means we have to go back and tell the folks who have the unretrofitted houses that they really should be insuring these for a lot more, because they are so much more damageable than models previously predicted. So,
but before I hand this to Sharyl to answer the same question, let me just amplify a little bit on what Janiele just said. PEER is the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bunch of California universities with laboratories that do earthquake engineering stuff. And, they tested the heck out of the parts. They tested the heck out of the retrofit that Janiele's talking about here. So although there's not a whole bunch of actuarial data out there, there's several anecdotes of side-by-side buildings, one of which was retrofitted and didn't fall down, and one of which was not retrofitted and did fall down. And on top of that, all of this laboratory experimentation. So that there's no question in the scholars and the practitioners' minds who have been involved in this, that these retrofits are going to work. Am I stating that correctly, Janiele?
Spot on. And I think, thank you for that distinction. Yeah, we don't have the actuarial proof because nobody was really keeping records, and we're certainly hoping that that's not going to be the an issue going forward.
Thank you. I think that's great. I'll just add a couple things. I think the Northridge quake, which Janiele went door to door at hundreds, if not 1,000 homes that experienced damage, that was the wake-up call as far as community-wide scale of impact. And there's fairly good data on losses from that event. But again, you don't have these events very often. The Earthquake Brace and Bolt program creates a natural experiment opportunity. So now we have documented retrofits of known quality spread all throughout the state. And unfortunately, please, Canada, do not wait until our natural experiment takes place. I understand the skepticism, but that peer project, just to clarify a little further, Keith mentioned shake table testing. So they did both small scale, which is just like the cripple wall testing until failure under lots of different construction configurations. And then they did larger scale testing, like a full mock-up of a little part of the house, all the way up to the roof. And then they did loss modeling, simulation type work as well. So the best available, is you go to the literature, you go to the lab, and you go to the loss models. And all three of those are pointing to the same thing. So in a sense, we feel like we're triangulating on the truth by going to as many different types of evidence as we can.
Let me amplify on that as well. So I said laboratory experiments, and Janiele referred to the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center. But this isn't simply one bunch of studies. There are multiple studies by multiple research teams in multiple different approaches. There is no question in the minds of the profession that this kind of retrofit is going to work. I mean, there's just a strong consensus. There are, uncertainties at the fringes about this kind of clip versus that kind of clip, and what do you do about the corners of the stucco, and stuff, little things that where there are open questions. But big picture, these retrofits are going to work. That's not possible that it won't.
I to play devil's advocate, Keith, I think the skepticism for a lot of people, the next one after does the retrofit prevent loss, is how likely is the shaking at my house?
Yeah.
And how likely is my house to be the worst one on the block? And I do think you have to admit, Janiele, I'd love your opinion on this, that it's a lumpy distribution. There are a lot of houses that will have the, $5,000 to $25,000 of repair necessitated, and there are a subset that will have total foundation collapse, slide off repair that's on the order of $400,000, or in some cases irreparability, walk away from the house level of impact. And we saw that a lot in Napa. There were many homes that people just didn't repair because it was not cost beneficial to them. They had enough on the mortgage left. It was better just to, foreclose, and those properties then remain blighted. So I think for a lot of us, we overcome some of the probability skepticism by looking at that universe of neighborhood effects, community effects, regional recovery effects. And we don't have a lot of good models. It's just an extremely hard research question to map out those ripple effects. Keith is one of the most advanced persons that I know of planetary-wise in trying to make probabilistic models that show some of those ripple effects. But even those do not touch, and Keith is just working at the cutting edge of two things that really matter to me. Both of them mentioned the emotional impacts of an event. Okay, we're talking PTSD, we're talking anxiety, and we're talking hopelessness. Mm-hmm. Those things have value, even though we don't insure against them. Well, actually, you could say our national, whatever our national health insurance strategy is here in the US, it's really not very cohesive or comprehensive. But those costs are going to go to the Canadian healthcare system. Don't mistake it. It's hard to estimate how, but they're going to happen. And when those family members, can't go to work for a long period of time, that also affects, their children's performance in life, their ability to care for elders. I mean, there's a whole realm of emotional impacts there that are very difficult to value because they're non-monetary. But even if you could extend, some of that logic into monetary space, I think there's a pretty clear and convincing pathway there of real impact. And then on the other side, okay, I lost my thread on the second one because I get so excited about the emotional stuff. And I currently am doing an earthquake early warning cost benefit analysis for the California Office of Emergency Services. And there again, the emotional loss avoided is a significant value for investing in that kind of a system. And we're also trying to push the edge on being able to represent that. It's what people want from their government, actually. I believe that the government is plays a key role in trying to reduce risk of all negative impacts in people's lives. And I think we're just understanding, only at the cusp of understanding what that looks like for emotional well-being. And that's going to be where the public conversation is on a lot of things, including climate adaptation. So it's a very interesting area of interest for me.
Let me bring turn our conversation to not the nuts and bolts of the retrofit, but the nuts and bolts of the communication. I love, the talk about receiver-focused communication, but what channel? I mean, what have you found to be the most effective communication channels for actually reaching people? How do we reach the people? Do you put ads in the newspaper? Do you put an insert in their insurance? What works? How do we reach them?
Yeah. So Sharyl, I'm anxious to hear your comments, but let me tell you what we've done. And so I said we started in 4 zip codes. So 4 zip codes, you can't really use mainstream media, because then you're broadcasting to everybody that there's a program that they can't participate in. So we kind of went local papers, local radio, local neighborhood councils in LA, neighborhood city councils, and actual door hangers on pre-1940 houses in the communities, because it was a small area. And 250 people registered. We wanted to do 20 houses. We did 9. So the first year was that a success? I mean, it was small numbers. And then the next year, 600. And then, it was very clear that, there was a market there. But the coolest thing is that we got to a point, and I can't tell you what year it was, that we were able to use kind of call it mass media. So, we're doing press conferences and people. So a lot of people are hearing about it. But what I know, and I know this from just talking to as many people as I can, is that, and I call it social capital, Sharyl, it's that when people hear about it from their friend, their neighbor, their relative, their dentist, somebody that they trust. And so we have understood that connection between, just me out there chatting to a Rotary group or something, and them hearing about it from somebody that they trust. So the idea was to get enough people, kind of God, there's so many parallels to the pandemic. We had to get that critical mass, the critical mass, exactly.
Yeah.
And and so I want to hear your comments on that.
Well,
is it a do?
We call it, there's lots of different phrases for it, diffusion of innovation. I mean, thinking about it, like an iPhone, like it's not as sexy and immediately useful as that, but the way that adoption of new behaviors happens in an exponential and networked manner. So we shouldn't expect an immediate 20% uptake. That's just not how these things happen in any field. The more you create a burning platform underneath that makes, either desire or fear, that makes people pay attention to it, the faster you can get uptake right at the tip. But I can weigh in on best practices from risk communication in other fields. And I've mentioned the tie to positive emotions, not scare tactics. And CE8 has done a beautiful job of really emphasizing the doability, the satisfaction, the peace of mind, the protection of things and family members that you love, and securing your future. This is the positive language, not this bad thing might happen to you, and look at this burning house. You need a little of that, because you got to be honest about the risk and show people that it's real, but tie to positive emotions. The other, I cannot underestimate the social influences of behavior in new, unfamiliar terrain like this. So educating intermediaries is one that you go to in the risk communication literature. And by intermediaries, I mean insurance agents, I mean general contractors, home inspectors, building officials, who are the players in somebody needing to take this action. And if they understand a lot of these big picture details and are able to confidently communicate and are kind of, they know a lot of people who have done this and what their experiences are going to be like that can kind of be a surrogate for people that eases the path. And then kind of that's sort of the technical people that you might encounter if you start to go down this path. The other way is to work through existing organizations that people have high trust in already that have nothing to do with earthquake retrofit, but that do have a mission that's related to the things that earthquake retrofit can do for you, like economic well-being and job retention. And, here we're talking about affordable housing advocates and faith-based organizations and employers. If I were Google, I would have a program to help my employees retrofit their homes. What a wonderful benefit to offer that leads people towards better quality of life and confidence and commitment to their company and their ability to show up for work on day 2 after a quake. So think about it. It's okay to be self-interested as an employer. And I would start by getting my own house in order as a business, that my employees are prepared to be of service to their families, so that they can concentrate on their work again, to be of service to their neighbors and community, and to be of service to their employer and the role that your employer plays in community.
Yeah. So Sharyl, I want to tell you an interesting thing about the intermediary is that we thought, hey, we've got, 25 participating insurers. How can they help us get the word out? Because what we found is we keep record of how many people have completed the EBB retrofit and self-declare that they have earthquake insurance. And it's something like 30%.
Earthquake brace and bolts, by the way, EBB.
What did I say?
You said EBB.
Oh, thank you. Earthquake brace and bolt. Thank you. Yes, acronyms are horrible and I'm horrible with them. So I apologize for that. So earthquake brace and bolt had about a third of the people who have completed actually have earthquake insurance. So it's, kind of early adopters. We're sensing this group. So we went to our participating insurers and we said, can you help us market this program? And so we had a couple of insurers who said, yeah, we're gonna give it a shot. And we worked with kind of local insurance agents. And they came back to us and they said, nah, what we're hearing from them is it's too expensive and they can't get contractors. And we thought, okay, wait. Okay, so we had at that time something like 15,000 retrofits under our belt. So we had data. And so with the intermediary, we had to step in and do quite a bit of intervention to give them the tools that they needed to be a successful intermediary. Because when they heard the negative comments from, and not people who had completed the retrofit, but others they were trying to influence, they didn't have what they needed to be able to counter that. And like we do with the data and with the experience. So we found that we think it can be successful, Sharyl, but there's no benefit there's no financial benefit to them to provide this information to their customer. And so there's some broken links.
So it's not a big money maker for general contractors.
No, I'm saying for the insurance companies.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
For them to tell, really, everybody who has a pre-1980 house that they insure, they should be telling you should retrofit your house. And I think that it's more of a public service to them, they feel, because they don't get any benefit for it. Even if those folks go out and get earthquake insurance, there's not a huge monetary gain.
Well, it's an investment. It's an investment in the stability of the housing market that they insure for other purposes.
It's absolutely the right thing to do, but we haven't, as I said, there's some broken links there that we've been working on.
Yeah, I would think realtors might have a more direct, ability to sell houses, ability to sell them for more, ability to gain trust from their buyers. But that's also been hard. A lot of realtors are resistant to anything that they feel might keep people from wanting to buy homes. So talking about earthquake risk, is that just deterring home buyers? I don't think so, but I do think it creates an unpleasant conversation that realtors like to avoid unless they have really good news, like, hey, you can get this money The city of Berkeley did a wonderful program that I just think is a super no-brainer, which is to offer a transfer tax rebate on homes that, on the money that you put into seismic improvements for your house. And they actually do some energy improvement.
Yeah, no, it's awesome.
Transfer tax that bumped up retrofit rates incredibly. What they didn't have in place at the time was the type of quality control for the retrofit work that was done that Janiele's program has been able to demonstrate how to do.
Right, which will always be a challenge. But I have to say, there's this brilliant person who did this study about
where this is going.
Keith, I should let you describe it, but I tell you, Keith did wrote a paper about the increase in sale price for retrofitted houses, and I have used that on a number of occasions to presentations to real estate professionals, and they're very excited about it because and I say this should be going in the multiple listing. This should be something that is listed up there with, it's got a forced air heater, and it's got this and air conditioning, and it's been seismically retrofit, code compliance seismic retrofit. And 17%, I believe, was the number, Keith, in California.
Yeah, like that can be $100,000 of increased resale value for a retrofit that costs about $10,000.
That's right.
Now, that was California, where people may be more aware of earthquakes and maybe more scared of them, and maybe be more motivated.
Right.
We don't know what that what that effect would be in BC or in Montreal.
Right.
Yeah. So just two-way communication here, folks. I can two-way it with Janiele and Keith anytime I want. What I want to know is how, from the audience, if you could just even write a statement, it doesn't have to be a question. How do you see what we're talking about here relating to your work? What's relevant, feels relevant to you? What kind of questions or ideas come up to you hearing what we've been talking about before?
Yeah.
It's an invitation, and I really get a lot of value from learning about the impression that this information has, and it's relevant.
Well, Sharyl, I used to say that when I went out and did public speaking, the most important part wasn't what was coming out of my mouth, but the listening, because in the, just the before, the after, the questions, I learned what was important to people. I learned how they related to what I said. When you have people saying something to you afterwards that you specifically, denounced, you're going, okay, that didn't, I didn't get there with that. Those things were so important, and the pandemic just put a huge kibosh on that. I miss that interaction and the ability for people to come up to me afterwards in private, and say, hey, my house. I get a lot of that. So I'm not seeing anything in the question and answer. We have a shy group who Keith, if they send a question afterwards, we'd like to hear it, because we'd love to get back.
I'm going to start putting questions myself in there. And I just put one in there. Do you think relevant Canadian homeowners, so owners of actual wood frame houses, understand the facts about earthquake risks that we presented today? So what's the state of the understanding among homeowners? And that could be yourself. And then I also think, how about in your company?
They can't see the chat. The chat is just among.
Okay. Well, you heard my question. Do you think relevant Canadian homeowners understand the facts? What's the state of understanding?
Because you have higher take up in earthquake insurance, Keith, than we certainly have in California with all of our risk.
And not knowing much about the pricing of earthquake insurance in BC, or how it's offered, I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm afraid I don't. I should know that, but I have not taken the time to study it.
Yeah.
I want to turn, while we're waiting for people to respond, I want to turn to this business of FEMA P1100. Janiele, you mentioned that 2-3 times. And that may not mean quite so much to a Canadian audience. FEMA P1100, correct me if I'm wrong, is a document published by the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Correct.
And you can download it for free.
Yes.
And it has all the drawings and it has all the specifications that a construction contractor would need to do the seismic retrofit. So you can, again, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no engineer who needs to be involved in this. You don't have to
Correct.
hire an engineer to do a design. You just hire a contractor and say, do this.
Do this.
Yep. And they know what to do, and you're going to get something that's fairly predictable. My question, though, is that doesn't the CEA want to? Does the CEA want to confirm that the work was done correctly? And if so, how do you know it was done correctly?
Right. So with our retrofit, okay, there's two ways we want to know it was done correctly. One is, let me start with the insurance side of the house, is we do have those hazard reduction discounts if you do a code compliant retrofit. So we do require that they have a contractor or engineer sign a form that it's in accordance with. And we have more than the FEMA P1100. We have a couple of even some grandfathered uniform building codes sections. If the contractor can say, yes, it was retrofitted in accordance with this, then they can get that hazard reduction discount. In order to not, we send inspectors out after the fact randomly to see how the construction work is going in our earthquake brace and bolt program. And it's about a $1,200 inspection fee. And so we can't do that on every single retrofit. So we are relying on the classic building permit process. So the contractor has to, or the do-it-yourselfer, go in, get the permit. We require they put the standard on the permit that the retrofit is being done in accordance with this FEMA P1100. And so the building department, if they do their job, is supposed to do some form of due diligence at the end of the project, whether it's a full climbing under the house, or a robot, or looking at photographs to say that yes, this appears to be in general conformance with this document. And our post retrofit inspections appear to confirm that the work is generally being done well. And we identified some kind of spots where contractors were missing. If we find a building department or a contractor that's essentially what I call misbehaving, if we see something that is not code compliant, we'll send letters to them. And that's just with that spot check. And just knowing that we can do that, I think, has elevated the work a little bit, because the contractor knows that we can pull them from our directory if they misbehave, and our directory is free advertising. You have to be on our directory as a contractor to do the work. And then as a building department, of course, we told them we reserve the right to remove our program from your city. And you can imagine, as a building official, to hear that the mayor and city council is going to find out that your lack of due diligence in the permit process caused the state to pull this program out of our city is not something they want to hear. So I call it leverage. The quality control is through the permit process, but with the added leverage that we provide because we're putting money into a community.
Great. Well, we are just about out of time. I would pose another question, but you wouldn't have time to answer it. Let me, before I thank you and sign off, let me just remind our attendees once again that we have 2 Friday Fora next month. On June the 9th, Julius Gombos on nature-based flood protection in Toronto, and June 23rd, Aisha Portaksu on the Turkey and Syria earthquakes. And with that, I'm going to once again thank our esteemed speakers. Thank you so much, ladies. This is great. I always love talking to you, and if it was just the 3 of us, webinar would go on.
We'd be here at 6 o'clock tonight.
Still feels valuable. Keith, can I have like a final word kind of thing?
Please, yeah.
I want to ask people, if you've cared enough about this issue to watch through to the end of this webinar, the takeaway question I would ask you to think about and get curious about is, how well does your profession have a handle on your level of risk exposure to this problem? And if you don't know what it is, can you afford not to know what it is? Understanding what pathways, through which pathways this might affect you and your mission. You might be able to be the hero to your organization by raising your hand and taking a little back of the envelope approach and bringing a huge underbelly, missing scale on smog, the dragon, and showing that to your superiors and your colleagues, and really doing some good here for a lot of homeowners as well as your organization's mission. So how well do you have a handle on whether this is a problem and how exposed you are to it? You could be a real hero here.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sharyl, Keith, always a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time and interest.
Bye,
Thanks.
Take care.